Being labelled a conspiracy theorist doesn't have quite the sting it used to, due to it being thrown around with such abandon that it has lost almost all of its power. But as debased as it is, as an insult, it still grates. And one of the reasons for that is what lies beneath the slur. It's not because we believe the things we do. It's not that. Not exactly. What it is that it is implied that we are unable to filter the truth from lies, from obvious lies. And that is designed to equate believing conspiracies to believing in fairy tales, like children. The insult is that we are unable to filter truth from obvious lies in the way that adults do, in the way that they, as adults, do, and we, as children, do not. To label someone as a conspiracy theorist is really to label an adult a child. So it remains annoying, to say the least, when someone labels you a conspiracy theorist, and it's even more so when that person happens to be a family member. But sometimes the accusation, or perhaps I should say the implication, can work to your advantage. A couple of years back, I was touched when my daughters bought me a Faraday bag for my phone for Father's Day. They didn't accuse me of being a conspiracy theorist, but I suppose it was implied. They would never think of using such a thing themselves, having grown up with mobile phones being ubiquitous, but I was charmed by the gift. For those who have forgotten their science lessons, a Faraday cage was a box made up of a fine wire mesh that no electrical signals can penetrate. A Faraday bag is a pouch that makes your phone invisible and therefore untrackable whilst it is in the bag. Of course, it becomes visible and traceable immediately it is removed from the bag as it begins searching for a network. But it was the thought that counted. It wasn't socks. They had thought about it and came up with something unusual and personal that I would get utility and satisfaction from. So, like I say, I was pleased that they had thought to indulge me my interest, even if they didn't share the same concerns themselves. I like to think that because if they'd gone to the trouble to buy me such a thing, they would at least have exposed themselves to the reasons why such a product existed in the first place. The fact that the younger of my girls now agrees with much of what Mrs. X and I think, and the older one has shifted her position on the jibber-jabber, and considerably so, suggests that my concerns haven't fallen on completely deaf ears. Both of them are a lot more aware than they were before. And I recently had a similar experience with my mum. As I said before, I've been working on my mum for some time, and since COVID, I've been working especially hard to counter the official narrative that my sister was fully on board with. I'd tell her about the demos I would go on, and I'd always try and remember to bring a copy of the Light newspaper to give to her. And she'd read it too, and sometimes tell me about some other alternative theory that she'd gleaned from the paper. What's strange though is that she never watches any of my videos, which I'm a little miffed about, if I'm honest. Although she did watch the one where I visited Richard Vobes. You'd have thought that might have piqued her interest, but it seems not. I know I'm now 55, but it does feel similar to how you might feel as if your parents haven't bothered to turn up to watch you play the innkeeper in the nativity play when you were 6. But I digress. We must put aside childish things. However, as with my girls, my little seeds of information have not fallen on completely stony ground. Since we lost my dad in 2019, my mum has been on her own, but she busies herself with her garden, her little sausage dog, and in the evening she reads and watches her telly favourites, Downton Abbey, some choice American crime shows, Endeavour and other detective stuff. To my delight, she now rarely watches anything on the BBC or the other mainstream channels, but if she comes across something that I might like, she lets me know. Or come Christmas or birthday, I'll get a box set. One of the recent highlights was a remake in serial form of the classic Michael Caine 60s spy film, The Ipcress File. But another was an American show, person of interest, which my non-American viewers may not be familiar with. The reason she bought me that was because I had been telling her about Edward Snowden and about surveillance generally. Yes, I harangue people in my private life too, and she thought that I would like it. And I do. For anybody who hadn't seen it, the premise is set up by a narration at the start of every episode. You are being watched. The government has a secret system, a machine that spies on you every hour of every day. I know because I built it. The narrator is a reclusive and socially awkward billionaire tech nerd who built the surveillance machine to detect acts of terror, but it sees everything. In some vague and unexplained way, it flags up the social security numbers of individuals who are likely to be involved, either as victim or perpetrator in violent crimes. Since the machine was built to detect acts of terror for the US government, so it is revealed early on, the government is uninterested in crimes involving ordinary people. But our billionaire wants to help people, and so enlists the help of a burnt-out CIA Special Forces all-round Superman character that is the other half of this crime-fighting duo. So far, so much cheese, and the show is often merely a standard crime thriller, fairly indistinguishable from countless others. But it does have some real philosophical depth by virtue of its subject matter, and the backstory is teased out slowly. I'm some way into the second series, and there is much still to be revealed. One of the more interesting things about the show is that it first aired in September of 2011, almost exactly a decade after the World Trade Center attacks, but over a year and a half before Edward Snowden famously spilled the beans on the US government's unwarranted, illegal and widespread spying on the American public. Were there others in the intelligence world not quite as courageous as Snowden, but equally disturbed by what they found themselves doing to the liberty of Americans in the name of the security, supposedly, of Americans? Was their inside knowledge part of the premise for the show? The billionaire tech nerd, Harold Finch, may have been modelled on NSA whistleblower William Binney, since Finch's character and that of his deceased business partner, originally, in an act of supreme patriotism, sold the system to the government for the princely sum of $1. William Binney's real-life act of supreme patriotism was to design a surveillance system that not only kept tabs on known or suspected terrorists, but did so whilst not infringing on the privacy and the Fourth Amendment rights of the innocent and law-abiding American public. He presented his system to his bosses at the NSA, highlighting its advantages over a mass surveillance system that was in competition with his design. Binney's system cost a modest $3 million, protected the privacy of ordinary Americans, and had the unique advantage over its mass surveillance alternative of not forcing its analysts to search for the proverbial needle in a haystack, principally by not piling on more hay. The competitor system, by comparison, collected all data: landline phone calls, mobile phone calls, text, emails, web history, everything on the burgeoning social media sites, and anything else in digital communication, and cost $100 million. The NSA, one of whose unofficial slogans was "Never spy on Americans," of course chose the needle in a haystack mass surveillance system and requested $100 million from the US Treasury to pay for it. From that moment on, the National Security Agency was violating the Fourth Amendment hundreds of millions of times every day, and has been doing so for over 2 decades. So the premier intelligence agency of the United States has been vomiting all over the Constitution, billions and billions and billions of times over. How can that be described as anything other than treason? So this is the surveillance state. This is the reality of it. What we were promised whenever surveillance was expanded was person of interest. What we got was 1984 and V for Vendetta. What I found interesting about Person of Interest was its idealised image of surveillance. I don't say this is a rebuke to the show, because despite its sometimes bland plot lines, it does tackle the thorny issue of unwarranted surveillance. Those bland plot lines are the positive side of surveillance. An all-seeing and benevolent father figure, or big brother perhaps, watches over us for the sole purpose of protecting us from harm. If the danger gets too close, the cool and calm but uncompromising and deadly when necessary action figure of John Reese will turn up and battle the bad guys without ever messing up his suit. One of the ways that Person of Interest is watchable, as opposed to being utterly unwatchable, as so many shows that portray law enforcers as heroic actually are, is that one of the baddies is the CIA. Of course, this is nothing new. The CIA and the intelligence services have been portrayed as ruthless and amoral tossers as far back as 1975's 3 Days of the Condor and the Clint Eastwood thriller The Eiger Sanction, and all the way up to the present day with the Bourne franchise. In fact, their moral degeneracy was even implied in Hitchcock's comedy thriller epic North by Northwest as far back as 1959. Our heroes, Finch and Reese, are motivated by doing good, whereas the CIA are motivated, quite correctly as recent events have shown, merely by power. Interestingly, I'm in the middle of a subplot where an FBI agent says he wants to expose what the CIA has become. If the programme were being made today, in the light of the Twitter files, would the FBI get press as good as this today? Far from being disgusted by this portrayal, as I usually am by professional peeping toms being painted as heroes, I just thought it curious that two branches of the intelligence communities were being characterised as on opposite sides of the moral universe. If it were transposed to a British setting, it would be like MI6 being the corrupt villains, whilst MI5 were bravely battling that corruption. Like I say, a curious state of affairs, and not one that is supported by any kind of reality. For it should be obvious to anyone paying even the slightest attention that the surveillance state is there for the control of the population and for the protection not of that population, but for the protection of the existing power structure. Seemingly endless resources are expended on keeping Julian Assange in prison, whilst machete-wielding maniacs go unchallenged, unprosecuted and unpunished in London, and with predictably horrific results, just recently in Glasgow. The British state, while seemingly uninterested in dealing with such urgent and obvious dangers affecting ordinary members of the public, however, remains committed to maintaining the fig leaf of legal due process, whilst continuing to suck on the American cock in the name of the special relationship. Whilst the US State Department's behaviour towards Assange is indeed despicable, the toadying of the British state is, if anything, even worse. And this institutional behaviour chimes perfectly with the so-called special relationship between America's NSA and Britain's equivalent, GCHQ, as revealed by Edward Snowden 10 years ago. As intelligence sharing forms the basis of that much vaunted special relationship, with the NSA of course assuming the larger role, Britain's very own contemptible peeping toms made it their mission to outdo even the Americans by just how much more they could violate their own citizens' privacy. In this utterly pathetic contest, the British spooks, unrestrained even theoretically by the US Bill of Rights, revealed themselves to be even more effective, which is to say worse, than their American cousins. So, Person of Interest is a fantasy, a ridiculously naive one. Is it perhaps even a childish one? But childishness is different to naivety. It's naive to disbelieve that powerful people will do anything to maintain their power. But is it childish? Maybe what is childish is refusing to believe that powerful people do conspire to that end. Maybe what is childish is believing that someone else is uniquely qualified to know what's best for you. Maybe what is childish is believing that others know what you should be able to hear and, moreover, what you should be able to say. And maybe what is childish is believing that someone else has the moral authority to be able to observe you unseen, whilst you cannot do the same to them. It seems to me that believing that politicians, law enforcers, technocratic professionals and media talking heads know more than us purely by virtue of the positions they hold effectively makes them the adults in this relationship and us, conversely, the children. It seems to me that there can be no better illustration of a parent-child dynamic than that. It seems to me that that is childishness. And is it not high time to put away childish things?